The restricted legendary Pokemon have always been some of the most powerful, badass Pokemon in the series. But over the years, Game Freak has gotten a lot better at balancing these powerful legendary Pokemon, leaving some of our old favorites in position where they are practically unusable or just completely outclassed in competitive Pokemon. I have two great examples of how well this balancing is going. Here's Mewtwo, the OG, arguably the most powerful Pokemon ever, at least at the time of its introductory generation. Being a Psychic type bolstering a huge 154 special attack, paired up with 130 speed and a signature move in Psystrike, which is a 100 base power special move that deals damage based on the opponent's defensive stat, not the special defense. Then, we have everyone's favorite horse, Calyrax Shadow Rider, who is a Psychic type with the added benefit of being a Ghost type. Rocking a casual 165 special attack and 150 speed, paired with arguably the most powerful signature move being Astral Barrage with 120 base power, that's also a spread move. Then, on top of that, they both have the ability Unnerve, but here's the real kicker. Mewtwo has to pick between Unnerve and Pressure, while Calyrax gets Unnerve, and on top of that, thanks to its ability as one, it also gets Grim Neigh, which gives a +1 to the user's special attack stat every time it picks up a KO. And as you could imagine, when you're the fastest Pokemon in the game with a ridiculous spread stab move, things can get out of hand pretty quickly. Another great example of the recent changes to balancing is Groudon and Koraidon. Now, I'm not going to compare anything other than their abilities. Neither of these Pokemon are fire types, so they don't inherently get any boost directly from setting up the sun, but Drat simply just sets the sun, which is honestly a fantastic ability. But Oricorium Pulse not only sets up the sun, but it also gives Koraidon a 1.33 times boost to its attack stat while in the sun, which is essentially a free life orb without any drawbacks. We can also use these four Pokemon to look at another very important aspect of the restricted legendary Pokemon, and that is their signature moves. These moves play a very important role in how viable a restricted legendary is. Calyrax and Groudon both have stab spread moves with 120 base power, but Astral Barrage is 100% accurate, while Precipice Blades is only 85%. Psystrike targets the opponent's defense stat rather than their special defense stat, while Collision Course deals an extra 1.33x times damage if it's super effective. So, as you can see, the new restricted legendary Pokemon definitely have it a little bit better with their restricted moves compared to some of the older ones. It's safe to say some of the older restricted legendary Pokemon need some love in the upcoming generation. And after playing a bunch of Regulation G in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, I think I have some pretty good ideas on how to change each one of them to make them a little bit more viable going forward. Let's kick things off with Mewtwo. As we said earlier, Mewtwo was that guy. He was him. But over time, he has faded into obscurity. A common thing a lot of new restricted legendary Pokemon got was good balancing with their stats, not wasting too many points in a stat it wouldn't use. So my first suggestion for Mewtwo would be moving 20 points away from its attack stat and putting it into its speed, making it the fastest restricted legendary Pokemon tied with Calyrax Shadow Rider, which is its biggest competition for a slot as they are both fast, powerful Psychic types. It also has arguably some of the worst abilities amongst restricted legendaries with both Pressure and Unnerve. So I suggest replacing one of these with Neuroforce, which was the signature ability of Ultra Necrozma, giving all super effective attacks a 1.25 times damage boost. And as Mewtwo is a clone of Mew, it has one of the deepest bags in all of Pokemon, having a huge range of coverage moves. So I think it would be incredibly fitting for Mewtwo to be the king of coverage moves. And finally, Psystrike is just Psyshock, but a little bit stronger. So I'm suggesting rather than hitting on the defensive side of things, it should always target whichever stat is lower. And additionally, allowing it to bypass all stat changes similar to Sacred Sword. Hopefully with these changes, it could contend with some of the other powerful restricted legendary Pokemon. Ho-Oh and Lugia definitely don't need the same amount of love that Mewtwo did, as both fill a pretty decent niche. Ho-Oh has a really solid typing, good bulk, a good attack stat, and regenerator, which is super fitting for it. So my only suggestion would be to make Sacred Fire 100% accurate and make it always burn. I know this might seem a little broken, but as it stands, it's a coin flip on whether or not it's gonna burn, and I kinda hate the idea of winning or losing a game based on a 50-50. So you could potentially drop the damage on it just a little bit, say to about 80, but I don't really think it's that necessary. Lugia is a very bulky Pokemon with access to its hidden ability, Multiscale, making it a very potent setup Pokemon. But it's a victim of being introduced in Generation 2 where 90 in an offensive stat wasn't too bad. So the first thing I'd like to change is move 10 of its points of attack to its special attack stat. And I want to make Aeroblast never miss, and on top of that, I want it to be a guaranteed crit. With Multiscale and Calm Mind, I think these changes can make for a very powerful setup threat. The Hoenn Trio historically have been one of the best sets of restricted legendaries ever introduced. Kyogre has the ability to set the rain and fire off powerful water spouts, and Groudon's ability to set up the sun and being one of the strongest ground types of all time leads to them always finding a place at the top of the usage charts. But in the recent formats, they've fallen off just a little bit. I think for the Weather Duo in particular, all they really need to do is making Precipice Blades and Origin Pulse both be 100% accurate. And with moves like Astral Barrage and Glacial Lance being 120 base power with 100% accuracy, I think it's only fitting to buff them just a little bit. Rayquaza is a bit of a different story. While its Mega is considered to be one of the greatest Pokemon of all time, its base form has what might be one of the greatest wastes of all time. Having 150 in both its attack and its special attack makes this Pokemon a devastating mixed attacker. But I think if we move 30 points away from its special attack stat and put 10 into each of its defensive stats and 10 into its speed, I think it would still be a really strong mixed attacker, but now it's a little bit faster and has a little bit more bulk. As for Airlock, it's the exact same ability as Cloud9. So the first thing I'd like to do is add a little bit of a buff to it, and that is the ability to nullify Tailwind. And I think this makes sense because I don't know how you can kick off a Tailwind if the air's being locked. And the other change I'd like to propose is also the ability to turn off terrain, but this might be a little too strong. The Creation Trio for the most part have always had a niche, but they have some of the most underwhelming abilities. While Telepathy has a niche, Pressure is just so lazy and bad. I really want to give my Discord a shout out for the next 3 as I was struggling to come up with ideas for them, but they really helped out. So if you guys want to participate in videos like this in the future, you should consider joining. I'll leave a link in the description, and while you're down there, consider subscribing. For Dialga, I want to propose moving 10 points from its speed stat and putting it into its special attack. This will help it be a better Trick Room sweeper for a restricted. I also want to keep the changes that were made with the Origin form, moving 20 points from its attack stat into its special defense. I think this change would make it a much more reliable Trick Room setter / sweeper. For the Origin form, I want to move another 20 points from its attack stat into its speed stat, as I think having them function in very different roles is important. I also want to give both forms the ability Armor Tail, as I think it greatly improves their role on Trick Room teams, and I think it's pretty fitting since, it's got some armor and it's got a tail. For its signature move, Roar of Time, I want to drop it down to 120 base power, increase it to 100% accuracy, and remove the recharge time. Palkia has historically really only seen play as a Kyogre counter, but when it's not a good Pokemon, it's pretty underwhelming. It has a bunch of really powerful stab moves like Hydro Pump, Draco Meteor, and Spatial Rend, but its biggest issue with all of these moves is they can miss. So I want to suggest an ability like No Guard, allowing it to never miss its own moves, but without the part of No Guard, meaning attackers can't miss it. Similar to what we did with Aeroblast, I also want to make it so Spatial Rend always crits. As for the stats, I want to move 20 attack points into the special attack, and for its Origin form, I'd like to move those attack points into speed. Once again, really trying to have different roles for these two Pokemon. Giratina has notoriously been one of the worst restricted legendary Pokemon of all time. So I think it's very fitting to give it the ability Shadow Tag, a very powerful ability for a Pokemon that is very underwhelming. And without access to moves like Perish Song and Fake Out, it would need support to really get the most out of the ability. And as Calyrex is allowed to have 120 base power stab ghost move that's also spread, I see no issue removing the 1-turn charge and Shadow Force, giving a weak Pokemon a strong, reliable stab move. The Tau Trio is pretty interesting, as they're quite similar to the Calyrex forms. For Zekrom and Reshiram, they're both kinda underwhelming, with Reshiram really only seeing play when Sun teams are really strong. I would suggest taking 20 points out of both of their lowest offensive stats and moving it to their speed stat, and making their two signature moves, Bolt Strike and Blue Flare, both 120 base power with 100 accuracy. For Kyurem, I have what I think is the most appropriate change in this whole video. I'm making one change, and that's giving this Pokemon Snow Warning. Snow and Sand have always felt kinda left in the dust, simply because Kyogre and Groudon have no real competition for Snow and Sand. So I think making another restricted have access to weather would be a massive needed change to the metagame. As for Kyurem Black and White, I want to keep the changes we made with Reshiram and Zekrom, moving points into their speed stat. I also want to make Iceburn and Free Shock both 100% accurate, giving them both the Calyrex treatment. I want both Kyurem Black and White to have Snow Warning and Terra Volt / Turbo Blaze. The Aura Trio is arguably the most balanced. The Aura Trio is a pretty strong set of restricted legendary Pokemon. In the past, Xerneas was known as the best Pokemon in the game, as Geomancy is one of the best setup moves ever created. But the newer restricted legendaries definitely give it a run for its money. Yveltal also has a very good kit, and one of the most consistent flying type moves in the game. I don't think either of these Pokemon really need any changes, but I do expect to see them receive some forms in Pokemon Legends ZA. As for Zygarde, its 50% form is pretty underwhelming, as it's a 600 base stat Pokemon with two abilities. One counters the previous two legendaries, while the other one only allows it to achieve its 100% form. I think the easiest change to make would be merging these two abilities together, because if neither Xerneas or Yveltal are in the match, it's a pretty useless ability. I also expect to see it receive some new forms in Pokemon Legends ZA. Perhaps we could see a 75% form that also has the ability Sandstream. I don't really know how well this would fit its lore, but I would really like to see them complete the weather circle with the restricted legendary Pokemon, having one for each weather. The Gen 7 legends are pretty interesting, as Solgaleo and Lunala are both pretty solid Pokemon. I'm going to suggest changing both of their weaker offensive stats. I want to move 20 special attack from Solgaleo and put it into its speed stat. And I want to move 20 attack to the defense for Lunala, making it bulkier and a better filling a support niche. As for the two Necrozma forms, one of the biggest travesties in all of Pokemon is losing Ultra Necrozma. So my suggestion would be giving them an item that allows them to achieve their ultimate forms when using Photon Geyser, even if they were to bring back one Z Crystal for Ultra Necrozma. My suggestion for the Gen 8 cover legends is pretty simple. Revert the changes that were made heading into Generation 9. Give Zacian back its 20 attack points, and give Zamazenta back its 20 stats that it lost, and while we're at it, give them back their abilities activating every time they switch in. I understand why we nerfed Zacian leaving Generation 8, but it was really OP in a Dynamax format, and so far we haven't really seen it live up to the hype in Generation 9. As for Zamazenta, it wasn't even considered that good in Generation 8, so losing stats just to mirror Zacian really sucked. Eternatus is a restricted that is a good ability away from being a really good Pokemon, but sadly it got the short end of the stick in Generation 8, being the only one of the restricteds to not get a busted ability. But it did get Pressure, the old Game Freak special. I have two suggestions for its ability. Both of them I think are pretty fitting. The first is Toxic Debris, which would make it super good into the Fire Water Grass balance teams that like to spam Fake Out and pivot around a bunch. The other would be Corrosion, but with a buff, making it so that its poison moves can hit Steel types and Poison types for neutral damage. The remaining two restricteds from Generation 8 are arguably the two most broken Pokemon of all time, Calyrex Shadow Rider and Calyrex Ice Rider. These Pokemon don't really need anything, except for maybe some nerfs. Realistically, I don't think they need any changes, as buffing other Pokemon would inherently make them a bit worse, but if I was to make any suggestions, it would be to both of their speed stats. I would move 10 special attack from Calyrex Ice Rider to its speed to make it a little less reliable under Trick Room, and I would move 10 speed from Calyrex Shadow Rider to its attack stat, making it not the fastest Pokemon in every format it's legal in. We have now arrived at Generation 9, the current generation, and if I'm being honest, I don't think I want to change anything as it's currently constructed. All three of them are quite good and seem pretty well balanced. The one thing I would like going into future games though is Terrapagos being able to achieve its big boy form, otherwise a 600 base stat restricted without its Terraform is likely to fade into obscurity. Some things I wanted to mention about the restricteds that I had in mind while making this list is a bunch of them sit around that 90 to 100 base speed tier, so it was pretty important for me to move some of them around. Another was I didn't really want to make any of these Pokemon too broken or get too far away from the Pokemon's lore. But a bunch of these Pokemon are almost unplayable when compared to some of the top threats in the game. I did my best to also be as unbiased as possible. But if you think I went a little too far one way or the other with any of these restricted legendaries, let me know down below. And also let me know any ideas you guys have, as I love speculating about this kind of stuff. And while you're down there, consider subscribing and hitting that like button so I know you guys like this kind of content and I can make more videos like this in the future.